In this video, I'm going to talk about the advantages of object-oriented programming in PHP. I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why you'd want to learn it, and at the same time, we're actually going to learn just a little bit of theory about what object-oriented programming is really about. In a nutshell, the biggest difference between writing object-oriented PHP code and classic old-school PHP code is that with object-oriented programming, you think of your software as being a series of virtual objects. What do I mean by virtual objects? You can think of a virtual object as being like a mini program inside a much larger program. So the larger program would be your entire PHP script, for instance. So let's say you were building a program like a blog, like WordPress, for instance. And inside the WordPress script, which is actually written in PHP, you would have a series of objects, which are basically mini programs that handle their own responsibilities. So, for instance, you might have an object that's sole job is to connect to the database. So, inside that portion of your WordPress blog engine, for instance, you would have all the code necessary, all the functions necessary, all the variables necessary, and other things that will allow you to connect to the database with no problems. Then you would have, let's say, another object that would handle all the validation, for instance. So you would have a validation object, and then you would have a database object, and you would have a whole bunch of other objects. The reason you would want to write software like this, essentially, it allows you to better organize your code. That's the fundamental underlying advantage. We're going to get into now the specific things that makes object-oriented PHP superior to the old school traditional method of writing your PHP code. Let's now go over 10 points that I'd like to discuss very briefly. Don't worry, it's not going to be too long. That basically, I think will give you a good idea of why you'd want to get into object-oriented PHP. We're going to look at 10 basic advantages. First of all, we've discussed that when you have object-oriented code, you're going to create reusable blocks of code. Your virtual objects, if they're designed properly, will be pieces of code that you can more easily use in the same project and also other PHP projects you will probably be working on at some future date. If you look at what's out there on the web now, there are frameworks like the Zen framework and Pair, amongst others, that are object oriented. And as such, it's pretty easy to actually use components, objects within these frameworks in your own work. We've done it recently, for instance, with a project called Idea 22, and we've used the Zen framework, but not in its entirety. We've actually used certain components within there, and the reason we were able to do this rather easily is because the Zen framework rather, is object-oriented. Because object-oriented code is, again, in modules or in components, it's really easy to update object-oriented systems as opposed to old style systems because their designs make it easy to sort of plug and play in terms of the various components within the system. So again, once we get into the nitty-gritty of writing code, object-oriented code, you're going to see how this is the case. But just take it on faith for now that when you do write object-oriented based PHP code, it's much easier to update aspects of your software. And of course, if you've done any type of programming, whether it be PHP or Java or any other language really, You're probably aware that it's not uncommon, actually, it's pretty much the rule of thumb that any piece of software that you're working on will at some point need to be updated. So that's where object-oriented based projects really start to shine because it's so easy to update them. Another advantage of object-oriented based systems is that it's a lot easier to have multiple programmers working on the same project or code base because again everything is segmented into objects. You can assign various programmers different objects to work on, and if they're designed properly from the get-go, they can work on their objects and not worry about touching or breaking code in other parts of the system. As some of you may have guessed, object-oriented programming really comes into play, really starts to shine as your project becomes more and more complex because of the structure that object-oriented programming does impose on you, and in a good way. On the flip side, if you have really simple scripts like 1 or 2 page jobs you got to do, writing object-oriented code may be overkill because at the beginning stages of a project, object-oriented code is more verbose. You're going to have to write more code to get the same job done in the beginning. But again, as the project becomes more and more complex, this becomes, the reverse occurs. Actually, through the mechanisms that are built into object-oriented PHP, you actually can start leveraging code, meaning you can start reusing code within your project, which at the end of the day means you're going to have a lot less code than you would otherwise. When you start writing object-oriented code in your projects on a regular basis, what you're going to be able to do in time is build up your own personal library of code that you will then be able to reuse in all your projects. That's when it starts to become very profitable. I did that actively in my Java years, actually, where in time I had developed a big library of objects that I created for myself from various clients over the years. And what happened in a short period of time, actually, I had a really mature code base that I knew it was bug-free and ready to go, that I could then leverage in all kinds of projects. And what that meant was I could really be competitive in terms of my pricing because I didn't have to write that code over again and I didn't have to debug it again. I just had to drop it into place and I knew it was going to work. Now, some of you may be saying, yeah, well, not all projects are the same. And that's true, but the vast majority of web development projects, whether it be in PHP, Java, Ruby, are very, very similar. So you're going to find yourself having to do the same things over and over and over again. So by using object-oriented programming techniques and mechanisms, you're going to be able to create a really robust set of code libraries that are custom made by yourself that will save you a lot of time, frustration, and as a freelancer could lead to a lot more money for you. When speaking about code libraries in the PHP community, we see a lot of that now, and I mentioned them before, the Zen framework and the Pear framework, which are 2 open source free code libraries, if you will, written in PHP for PHP developers, that if you leverage these things, it will save you a heck of a lot of time. When you know object-oriented principles is when you'll be able to really leverage these frameworks. If you don't, you're not going to really be able to use these valuable resources in your own work. And that's a shame because much of the power of PHP is found in these code libraries that are provided to you. So learning OO will allow you to leverage a lot of PHP frameworks and code libraries like Zen, like the Zen framework, like Pear, Smarty templates. There's a bunch of projects out there that are OO based. So it's yet another reason to learn object-oriented programming in PHP. Finally, the last 2 advantages. When you learn object-oriented programming in PHP, you'll learn object-oriented programming for just about every OOP language out there. Well, I should say OO language. you see that object-oriented principles are consistent across every object-oriented language, whether it be Java, C Sharp, Ruby, PHP, what have you. Once you learn the basics in PHP, you've learned the basics in all these other languages. So for you to jump over and learn another language like Ruby or Java, it's going to be much, much easier for you because you have learned the principles in PHP. There are differences in terms of syntax, and there are differences, especially when you get into the more arcane or the complex aspects of the languages. But I would say about 80% of it is pretty much the same. And the syntax differences are really minimal, so that's not a problem as far as I'm concerned. So again, like so many other things in programming, when you learn object-oriented principles in PHP, you will have learned these same principles in all these other languages. You'll be killing many birds with one stone. Finally, if you know OOP, whether it be in PHP or any other language, of course, you will have raised your value as a programmer, which means you'll be able to approach more projects, you'll be able to earn more money for your time. So besides all the geek advantages that I've mentioned before, there's actually some major financial advantages, whether you're a freelancer or whether you're working for a company. Knowing OOP is just going to increase your value, and it's going to put more money in your pocket. Now that I've discussed all the advantages, I thought I should conclude by discussing one or two disadvantages of OOP, and I think they're really minor. Number one, and I mentioned before actually, OOP code is more verbose, meaning you have to write more code to get the same job done. And this is only true, of course, when the projects you're working on are very small. If it's a 1 or 2 or 3 page script, something very simple, then you may not want to go the OO route. Although there are probably tons of libraries out there written OO that you can just plop in and use and not have to worry about that in the first place. But if you're writing from scratch and it's very short, you may just want to go with the old procedural or functions based classic PHP way of doing things. On the other hand, and if the project becomes a little bit more complex or you're more than one person working on a project, then you definitely want to go OO. The other disadvantage of object-oriented programming in the PHP environment is potentially speed. When you have object-oriented code running, it has a bunch of more things that the PHP interpreter has to deal with. And as such, it will be a little slower. In terms of the benchmarks and so on, I don't have the exact data. Logically speaking, it is a touch slower. Will it affect how the user perceives your software and so on? Probably not in most cases, but at the end of the day, it comes down to how well you write your system. But keep that in mind, OO code is a little slower at runtime, and so that's a factor. But I always think that if you save a heck of a lot of time and effort in terms of keeping and maintaining your code, if the code base is a little bit slower, it's not a big deal. You just put more processors behind your code. Just get a better server, essentially. But I wanted to point out those two shortcomings, if you want to call them that, with regards to OOP in PHP, just so that we have an even-handed look at this thing. Now that we covered the pros and the cons of object-oriented programming, we're going to actually jump in now and write our very first objects, and because there's no better way to learn than by actually doing it. So if you're a little unclear about certain things, it's pretty hazy to you, which I think for some of you it probably is. Don't worry, once we actually start building some objects in PHP, you're going to find this stuff clears up quite a bit.